In the snow-blanketed town of Ashworth, nestled deep within a valley where frost clung to windows like a warning, Christmas had a sinister reputation. For years, whispers floated among the townsfolk about the 12 haunts of Christmas. It wasn't a cheerful carol or a festive tradition. It was a curse. Every December, one unlucky family in town would endure a series of horrifying events, beginning 12 days before Christmas and culminating on Christmas Eve. Some families survived with fractured minds and trembling hands. Others vanished without a trace. This year, the curse fell upon the Morrow family. The Morrows were new to Ashworth, drawn by its postcard-perfect charm. Tom and Lily Morrow moved there with their 2 children, Ellie, 7, and Jacob, 11, hoping for a fresh start after years of city life. They bought a sprawling Victorian home at the edge of town, the kind of house with creaking floorboards and too many shadows. But it came cheap, and the Morrows chalked up its price to its age. They hadn't heard the stories. On the first night, it began innocuously. As snow fell silently outside, the family sat in their living room, the glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows. Jacob was the first to notice the faint melody, a soft, distant humming. "Silent night. Is someone singing outside?" he asked, walking to the frosted window. "No one would be out in this cold," Tom replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The humming grew louder, like a choir just beyond the front yard. Tom stepped outside, the icy wind biting at his face, but the yard was empty. The singing stopped the moment his boots crunched against the snow. He came back inside, shaking his head. "Probably the wind," he muttered. But it wasn't the wind. The second night, they found footprints. A single trail of bare footprints leading from the street to their front door. The prints were too large to be a child's and too slender to belong to a man. They stopped abruptly at the threshold, as if whoever or whatever made them had vanished into thin air. Tom called the local police. Officer Grayson arrived, his face pale when he saw the prints. "You should stay inside," was all he said, before leaving with barely a glance back. By the third night, the singing returned, louder this time, accompanied by whispers. Lily swore she heard her name. Lithely, it cooed from somewhere in the walls. On the fourth night, Ellie screamed. Her bedroom window was wide open despite being locked before bedtime, and her room was freezing. She pointed to the corner of the room, sobbing. "The man in the dark. He's smiling." Tom and Lily searched, but there was no one there. Still, Ellie refused to sleep in her room after that. The fifth night brought the smell. It wafted through the house, rotting meat mixed with a metallic tang. They searched everywhere but couldn't find the source. On the sixth night, Jacob discovered the writing. It was scrawled across the mirror in the upstairs bathroom in dripping red letters. 6 nights left. "Is this some kind of sick prank?" Tom yelled, his voice shaking as he scrubbed the words away. But no one was laughing. By the 7th night, the family was too terrified to sleep. They huddled together in the living room, keeping the lights on. Around midnight, the Christmas tree began to shake. Ornaments fell, shattering on the floor. The angel on top turned its head toward them, its porcelain face cracking as it whispered, "Run." On the 8th night, the snowmen appeared. 12 of them stood in their front yard, perfectly shaped and eerily lifelike. Each wore a tattered scarf and coal-black eyes that seemed to stare straight at the house. One of them held a knife in its twig hand. The Morrows didn't build them. By the 9th night, Lily wanted to leave, but the roads were blocked by a sudden snowstorm that hadn't been in the forecast. The power went out that night, plunging the house into darkness. That was when the scratching began. It came from inside the walls, a rhythmic, deliberate sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. On the 10th night, the family heard footsteps above them. Heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth in the attic. Tom grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat, determined to put an end to whatever was tormenting them. But when he opened the attic door, he found it empty, save for a single wooden rocking horse, swaying gently in the corner. The 11th night was the worst. The whispers turned to screams. They came from every direction. Outside, inside, upstairs, downstairs. The walls seemed to vibrate with them. Jacob clutched his ears, crying, "Make it stop! Make it stop!" Christmas Eve arrived. The 12th night, the family decided to stay awake until morning, praying the curse would end with the holiday. But as midnight approached, the house grew deathly silent. The kind of silence that pressed on their ears and made their hearts race. Then came the knocking. 12 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. Tom gripped the bat, his knuckles white. "Stay here," he whispered to Lily and the kids, his voice trembling. He approached the door, heart pounding. The knocks came again, louder this time. He flung the door open. No one was there, but the snowmen had moved. All 12 of them now stood in a circle around the house, their coal eyes glowing red. The last thing the Morrows ever saw was the snowmen closing in, their twig arms stretching unnaturally long, their coal eyes burning like embers. By Christmas morning, the house was empty. No sign of the Morrows remained, save for a single message carved into the frost-covered window. "Merry Christmas. Who's next?" 1 year later, the following Christmas, the haunting returned. This time, it targeted the Harper family. They lived on the opposite side of town, in a modest ranch-style home. Unlike the Morrows, the Harpers were longtime residents who had heard the stories but never believed them. That changed on December 13th. The first night, the Harpers' youngest, 4-year-old Sophie, woke her parents with a question that chilled them to their core. "Why is the man with no eyes staring at me from the window?" Her father, James, rushed to her room and peered outside. Nothing but darkness. He assured Sophie it was a dream, but as he turned off her bedside lamp, he noticed faint handprints on the frosted window pane. Too large to belong to Sophie, too high up to belong to a child. The next night, the singing began. This time, it wasn't Silent Night. The melody was darker, twisted, and unrecognizable. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. James and his wife Clara wandered the house with flashlights, searching for the source. But the sound seemed to bleed from the walls themselves. On the third night, Sophie disappeared from her bed. They found her an hour later, shivering in the backyard, barefoot in the snow. She didn't remember how she got there, but she kept mumbling about the smiling man who wanted her to play. The fourth night brought the shadow. It slithered along the walls of the Harper home like liquid darkness, defying the glow of the lamps and the fire in the hearth. It stopped at Sophie's bedroom door, lingering there for hours, before vanishing at dawn. By the fifth night, Clara begged James to leave town, but when they tried, their car wouldn't start. Neither would the neighbors' cars. Phones had no signal. It was as if the entire town was trapped under a dome of fear. On the sixth night, the house itself began to change. Doors opened and slammed on their own. The Christmas tree toppled over, its branches twisted into unnatural shapes. The ornaments shattered, their fragments spelling out the words, 6 more nights. James tried to call the police, but no one answered. When he drove to the station, he found it abandoned. The streets were eerily silent, and the few houses he passed seemed dark, as if the town itself had emptied overnight. The seventh night was colder than any in recent memory. The Harpers huddled together in the living room, their breath visible in the icy air despite the roaring fire. Around midnight, the windows began to rattle. Something heavy slammed against the front door, shaking the house to its foundation. "Don't open it," Clara whispered, clutching Sophie tightly. But James couldn't resist. He needed to know what was outside. He peeked through the peephole and screamed. His face turned white as he staggered back. "What is it?" Clara demanded. James shook his head, unable to speak. But when Clara looked through the peephole, she saw nothing, only the snow-covered yard. "What did you see?" she pressed. James finally managed to choke out 3 words. It was smiling. The final nights. By the 8th night, The Harper family stopped trying to fight the inevitable. They barricaded themselves in the basement, ignoring the scratches coming from the floor above them. On the 9th night, the singing returned, louder than ever. This time, Sophie joined in, her voice perfectly matching the haunting melody. Her eyes stared blankly ahead as she sang, her lips curling into a smile that wasn't her own. By the 10th night, Sophie was gone. James and Clara searched everywhere, but their daughter had vanished without a trace. All that remained was her teddy bear, soaked in something red and sticky. On the 11th night, Clara broke. She sat rocking in a corner, muttering to herself as the walls around them groaned like a living thing. James tried to stay strong, but the whispers in his head were relentless. They promised safety if he just let it in. And then came Christmas Eve, the 12th night. At precisely midnight, the front door burst open, though no wind or snow followed. The house grew impossibly silent. James and Clara stared at the staircase, holding their breath. Slowly, the creak of footsteps echoed through the house. Something descended the stairs. It wasn't Sophie. It wasn't human. Its elongated limbs twisted unnaturally as it crawled toward them, its eyeless face somehow smiling. The Harpers didn't even have time to scream. The legacy continues. By Christmas morning, the Harper house was empty. No one dared investigate. The townsfolk already knew what had happened. The legend of the 12 haunts of Christmas was no longer a tale to frighten children. It was a curse that lived among them. And every year, without fail, it would begin again. So if you ever find yourself in Ashworth around the holidays, and you hear faint singing in the distance, remember this. Don't look outside. Don't answer the door. And above all else, don't let it in. Because next Christmas, it might be you.